So finally a whole bunch of answers are at hand to common Warhammer 40k questions. Let's talk about all the details that Games Workshop has given us. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking core 40k changes once more, and in this video, following on from the balanced data slate, I thought I'd do a roundup of the fairly massive amount of small rules changes and things that Games Workshop brought alongside that update. Since 10th edition started, Games Workshop has basically had their core rules system, and then everything that was slightly wrong with the core rules or unclear or got lumped into a different document called the Designer's Commentary. In my opinion, it was a bit nebulous and annoying to access for people who weren't super engaged with the finer points of Games Workshop's updates for the hobby. The way they chose to do it was talking about a whole load of rules things in kind of general terms, adding definitions and things, though hidden within it were really quite a lot of actual core rules changes that hadn't actually made their way into the main rules when 10th edition launched, making the title for it being Designer's Commentary as a kind of misleading one really. In this big update, which sort of feels equivalent to a 10.5 edition for all the changes that they've made, it seems like they've taken a really good look at this document and redone it in a big way, putting the vast majority of things that are actual rules changes up at the top of the document, then going through a whole bunch of actual frequently asked questions with simple yes or no clarifications, and then for everything else like definitions and things, they still have that main section of the document that they had before. Overall, I think that's a really good change on a whole bunch of different levels. It makes it clear that within it there's a bunch of extra things for the core rules that they don't want to change in the main digital document. A whole load of things did have rulings one way or another, but still arguably needed an FAQ just to show people that yes, that is the way that they're intending them to be played. And it is still important to have those definitions and things, and I feel like it's a big win in terms of making things a little bit clearer for this whole thing. I do still think it's maybe kind of weird that they do have a digital core rules on the same site and then are making updates to it via a different document, which maybe feels like it defeats one of the benefits of a digital rule set. But it seems that they're thinking on that as they want the digital book to completely match the actual physical book, so that no one got confused with referencing page numbers and things like that, but I feel like it's maybe a little bit of a minor benefit, that really. Rules delivery aside for this video, I wanted to focus on all of the core game FAQs and minor errata changes, and maybe laser in on them a little bit more than the actual core rules changes that we talked about in the big balance update video yesterday. These are the items that I'd consider more core rules changes, the whole movement and pivoting thing that I talked about in a video earlier, a bunch of changes to the core stratagems, devastating wounds and hazardous now being mortal wounds again in one form, a bunch of balanced data slate changes to stratagems, things like captains, free stratagems, and reinforcements and stuff. Indirect fire always failing to hit on a roll of 1 to 3, and loyalist primarchs and core being able to move through ruin walls. I might cycle back to talk about a few of the others in videos in the future, but for today let's talk about everything else, a massive slew on simple rulings to slightly more niche 40k scenarios. For these changes, there's a good mix of some of them that are new, some of them that were already there, and some of them that are basically kind of similar but rewritten in some form. I'm going to go through the majority of the things that actually rule on things that people get confused on in-game. One area that has generated a bit of rules debate in the past is the whole out-of-phase rules with big guns never tire and firing deck, namely can you use either of those if you say fire in a different part of the turn like using Overwatch or some other special rule. This one isn't really a rules change, but in a couple of FAQs they underlined that you can't use either big guns never tire or firing deck in Overwatch, basically because both of those rules are indeed locked to the shooting phase, and they just underline that is as intended. It is a pretty relevant one, as if you've got a big vehicle that's locked up in combat, whether or not it can fire Overwatch could be a massive deal. The firing deck one maybe feels a little bit unintuitive. I guess maybe they do it to stop you effectively getting Overwatch with multiple units at once. I guess in theory you could get 1 CP for firing Overwatch with both the transport and its contents, which I guess might be stretching the value of the stratagem a bit. There were a few other clarifications to firing deck as well, most of which I think weren't rules changes, though it does look like they've patched an exploit for eliminators. Space Marine eliminators could do a thing where they could shoot while they're outside the transport, then use their move shoot move ability to embark on an impulsor, and then technically you could fire again with the firing deck previously. It was obviously not rules as intended, as it basically means your eliminators fire twice, and not really even all that powerful. It required quite a lot of points of unit setup, and the damage output wasn't spectacular. But in any case, if the units have shot, then they can't fire again out of a firing deck, as you'd expect. Otherwise, they keep the ban on one-shot special weapons being able to be thrown out of firing decks. You can't throw things like Genestealer Cult demo charges out of a firing deck of a Goliath, but to prevent you being able to use one-shot weapons multiple times, that's not allowed. And they also confirmed a few other things, that even if you advanced or fell back and then got into a transport, you can still use firing deck to fire those weapons, even if the units that got into the transport might not have been eligible to shoot otherwise. Again, that maybe feels a bit unintuitive, but I suppose it's just underlining that it's the vehicle with the firing deck doing the shooting, not the unit within. It is perhaps a bit surprising just how many rules questions the whole firing deck thing throws up. Sticking with one-shot weapons, again I believe that this one wasn't a rules change, but they now lay out the rules for restoring models or units very clearly. Basically, if you had a one-shot weapon in a unit that took casualties, say a Genestealer cultist that had thrown and used its demo charge, and then used its cult icon to restore models to that unit and set it back up again, it still comes back without the demo charge as it's the same model. On the other hand though, if that same unit was wiped out after using its demo charges, if the rules were for things like Cult Ambush to put an identical unit in reserve, it basically counts as a new unit, so that new unit does have the demo charges when it appears, and the same is true for some other things like Guard Armored Sentinels and Hunter Killer Missiles. Again, I don't believe there's any actual rules change there, but good to have it really clearly spelled out. There's more of a centralized FAQ as to the situation with first turn returns to reserves type abilities. Things like, say, the Alaris Custodians that have a rule that can return to reserves at the end of the enemy fight phase. And the question is, are they able to come back straight away? Say if you use that at the end of the opponent's turn 1, would you be able to bring them back in your turn 1? When in most missions you're not able to have reserves arrive until turn 2. This rule actually technically depends on the mission pack. I believe for Leviathan, most people tended to rule that you could do this, though I think it relied on a couple of sections that didn't really sound like they were particularly clearly worded, and I feel like you could have argued it different ways. The Pariah Nexus mission core rules make it a lot more clear though, and this FAQ backs that up. Pariah Nexus says that you can have them return back on turn 1 in any battle round, so they could teleport away at the bottom of enemy turn 1 and then come back in the reinforcements phase for yours. Though they say it does vary mission to mission, so say if you were playing other mission packs that didn't have that rule, they'd have to come back turn 2. So I guess it might vary a bit depending on the game that you're playing. I think if I was playing against people, I'd be inclined to just let them do it in any mission though, if it does seem that's the clear intent for the latest mission pack from Games Workshop. There was a minor one that they fixed in a prior update about gaining command points in the command phase. Some characters like Lord Solar allow you to generate an extra command point at the start of the command phase, and there was a slightly janky rules as written argument that that might not count towards your once per battle round limit, despite it kind of obviously not being the intent. The argument was that command points generated at the start of the command phase didn't count towards the total, though it seemed really clear, I think, to most people that that was referring to the standard one that you get as per the command phase, not other character rules. In any case, they make that very clear here to close any interpretations otherwise. Other CP that are gained at the start of the command phase don't get an exemption from that rule. A new one that ties in with the command reroll changes are basically anything that has fast dice rolling and allows a single reroll. If you've got a rule that allows you to reroll a single roll or a saving throw, and you were using fast dice rolling, you do get to roll all the dice that you're fast rolling together, and then pick out any that you wanted to reroll. This one really feels like a very good quality of life and just simplicity change for the game. It was the way that most people tended to play it anyway at a casual level. Technically the difference is that, say if you were rolling saving throws, you'd have to roll them one at a time to not gain any additional information before you decide whether to command point reroll. It did tend to be perfectly doable, was just a little bit less fiddly, and it was annoying having to try and explain it to people who didn't really get why you needed to do that. Nice just to put everyone on the same page. I guess it's a small boost to any abilities that do just have a single reroll. Technically you now get a little bit more information before deciding whether to commit to any of the rolls out of that set. Perhaps pairing with the movement rule changes, there were a few things for overhanging models. The movement changes means that overhanging models got to squeeze through gaps in terrain, which I thought was a pretty reasonable rule in my opinion. But they also had a few FAQs dedicated to it, asking about whether or not you could overhang the battlefield edge or your deployment zone. For the battlefield edge, the answer is yes, you can overhang the battlefield edge a little bit, but you still have to have either the entirety of your base on the board, or for vehicles you have to have the entirety of the hull on the board. But it does mean that things like this Bloodthirster could have part of their wings technically off table, I guess. Perhaps the most common question for this one is whether or not you might be able to have things like Flyers' wings off the edge of the table, and the answer to that would be no, as they're generally considered to be part of the vehicle's hull, so Flyers would have to generally make sure that they're not overhanging the edge of the table, and all parts of them are fully on the board. It was interesting to see that they've also got a line of sight question with that, basically saying if you had like the tip of a Bloodthirster's wing off the board, could you use that bit to draw line of sight to anything? And the answer is no. I guess it would be a bit of a weird situation if you had a wall that went all the way up to the battlefield's edge and the Bloodthirster was using off-table space to draw a line of sight round it. That would be a bit janky. Though apparently you get the worst of both worlds. If you're overhanging the board edge, your opponent can draw line of sight to any part of the model still, including bits that are off the battlefield, it sounds like. I guess the idea being that anything that overhangs the edge of the board doesn't give you an advantage. They also explicitly say that you can't overhang your deployment zone at all, unless there's literally no space any in your deployment zone to do so, in which case you must set up as much of the model as possible within your drop zone. Maybe in a similar sort of vein to that, there's some rules for supersized reserve models, which occasionally comes up with really big Forge World things. In the FAQ section, they give a simple answer to what happens for those things if they arrive from strategic reserve. The idea being that any of these models, if you put them anywhere, they can't get anywhere that's wholly within 6 inches of a battlefield edge and have to breach that limit just because of their sheer size. For any of these, you have to deploy them touching your battlefield edge while still being more than 9 inches away from enemy units, and then unless you're an aircraft miniature, the other units can't do anything else useful, so can't do things like making a shooting attack or do things like make a charge move that turn. So basically the idea is that you don't really want to put titans or enormous things off the board if you can avoid it. They probably just want to be deployed normally. Aircraft do have an exception to that though, so really big planes like say the Tau Tiger Shark, which is quite a competitively relevant one, that one can turn up and still be able to function normally. You just have to deploy it so it's touching the edge of the board. There was one clarification for who gets to call the Waaaghs First, or any other abilities that are declared at the start of the battle round, not necessarily within either player's turn. Usually if you have abilities like that that have sequencing conflicts within the player's turn it is, then the player whose turn it is gets to choose which order they go in. But if not, it was genuinely a little bit unclear. Technically the battle round starts and then the next player's turn begins, and just occasionally the order of declaring things like that could be important. Maybe Orc players deciding whether or not they're going to call the Waaagh if they're playing against an other Orc player, and there are a few other rules like some character datasheet abilities that trigger at the start of the battle round. If you do have 2 rules like this that happen outside of a turn, you roll off and the loser gets to decide first, so the opponent gets a little bit more information as to whether or not they've called the Waaagh or activated another powerful ability. For Fights on Death, they've clarified the way that this works a little bit. The main change that they've actually made to the text is that in the whole fighting process, they do say that you may make a pile-in before you're attacking, and then you select normal attacks for targets that you could be in reach of anyway. Then you do your damage, then you're destroyed. I feel like that's not the worst one to have spelled out. It does basically mean that Fight and Death units might not potentially be able to activate with all their models if, say, they get wiped out by something that just attacks the edge of their unit, leaving a whole load of models out of engagement range. There was a sequencing one to declaring a whole bunch of attacks and destroying an enemy unit halfway through all your units shooting. Say if you had a guard Lehman Ross and you targeted a bunch of different weapon profiles against an enemy knight or something, but you managed to kill it with your first shot of the Demolisher Cannon perhaps. As you'd expect, if you nominated a hunter-killer missile with one shot against that knight, then it would still count as expended, even if you'd blown it up already with the Demolisher Cannon and never got to roll the hunter-killer. That bit seemed like it was fairly obvious to me. The other bit that maybe was a tiny bit less obvious was whether or not you test hazardous tests. Say if that Lehman Ross had some plasma cannon sponsons, but you destroy it with your first shot of your turret weapon, do you still have to take the hazardous checks on your plasma guns? And the answer to that is still yes if you were overcharging them, even if you never actually get to roll the hit rolls or damage rolls because you've killed your target. That hazardous one probably isn't something that comes up super often, but good to know that you can't game hazardous by firing any hazardous weapons dead last to hope that you don't have to make the tests if you unexpectedly destroy your target. There was an underlining of things in the designer's commentary for when it counts whether or not you're holding an objective. Basically in the first turn you don't actually count as holding any objectives until the end of the command phase, even if intuitively it feels like you probably should be holding the one in your deployment zone, say if you put up a whole bunch of units on it right from the game's start. The vast majority of the time it doesn't actually really matter whether you hold anything in the command phase, but just for a few defined special rules it does. One of the more obvious ones are things that allow you to generate a resource of some sort if you're holding an objective in the command phase. So say for example the Gene Stealer called Acolyte Hybrids with their new datasheet in the Codex. They get to farm a command point in the command phase on a 4+ if they're holding the objective. That's done at the start of the command phase, so it means that you wouldn't be able to activate this turn 1, which is kind of a bit rubbish. I'm sort of surprised that they didn't change the wording on that as they did with the Orc Gretchen to be the start of the movement phase if they wanted to avoid this small problem. I'm not entirely sure I really like the ruling on this one. Feels like if you have a command point generating units that's sat on your deployment zone objective from turn 1, it should be able to roll turn 1. I think I would have been quite happy if they'd ruled that one the opposite way. Another one that I genuinely had seen debated were some certain datasheet abilities that have multiple different conditions to get different buffs on them. Perhaps the most obvious example being Necron Locust Destroyers, which they use as an example here. They get to reroll hit rolls of 1 if they target the closest enemy targets, and if the target of that attack was in range of an objective marker your opponent controls, you get to reroll the hit roll instead. I think that statement could genuinely be read in different ways depending on how generous you are being. You could just take them as entirely two separate sentences, or have the one follows on from the other. Games Workshop have ruled it though for multiple criteria things that you need to satisfy both conditions, so if you want your full hit rerolls out of Locust Destroyers, you'd have to be targeting something on an objective that is also the closest unit. You can't just get the full hit rerolls by shooting things off objectives full stop. Otherwise, redeployment rules are more formally defined as a common thing on lots of datasheets. It really clearly spells out when you can do these, underlines that you can use special deployment rules such as infiltrators to set them up again in unusual ways, states that you alternate between units if players have multiple different abilities, and beyond that, they've posted errata in basically most of the codexes to basically standardize the wording of that across all sorts of different codexes and indexes. I believe that in every case where it matters, you now do the redeployment before first turn is determined, not after. Lots of things specifically called out after before, and that was really quite powerful to basically get some perfect knowledge redeploys and put units exactly where they were needed. Seems that broadly speaking that one's no longer going to be possible anymore, and redeployments happen before you know who's got first turn, so it needs a bit of guesswork and trying to put them somewhere where it won't be a disaster if you go either first or second. One that they spelled out in an FAQ here that maybe isn't super intuitive in 40k is the Melta rule versus damage to 0 sort of rules. Melta weapons are the ones that can give you plus X amount of damage within half range, often plus 2 damage, but sometimes more. And then there's some abilities out there that can change the damage characteristic of an attack straight to 0, say the Thousand Suns Destined by Fate special rule, or the Rogel Dawn armor ability. When they're triggered, they usually just make one attack go away. Due to the way that altered values and modifiers work though, Melta weapons treat this one a bit unusually. Basically the main damage of the weapon gets turned to 0, but the plus 2 bit from the Melta special rule doesn't, as you do things that change the value first, and then anything that adds or subtracts. Again, I feel like this one's maybe one where the ruling is perhaps a bit unintuitive. It certainly makes sense in the way that they've set up modifier type rules, but still feels a bit strange that you have a big damage attack and then your damage to 0 rule only mitigates some of it. I bear in mind that this is for things that actually modify the characteristic of the damaged weapon outside of the weapon's base profile, so things like las cannons or bright lances that say have d6 plus 2 on their base profile, they still go completely to 0. The extra plus on that bit isn't a modifier, that's just literally part of the characteristic, so this is only for certain special rules that influence damage like Melta. Beyond that, they had a few other clarifications to modifying characteristics. Again, most of this isn't new, I don't think, but just trying to make sure that no stats characteristic modifiers can break the game in any major way. As well as the restrictions for how much you can modify certain dice rolls and things, they also have characteristics only being able to be changed to a minimum of certain values. Things like range and movement values can only go down to a base of 1 inches, strength and toughness can be minimum 1. Saving throws can't be better than a 1+, though still a 1 always fails there, so you don't actually get to save on a 1+, it'll still be effectively a 2+. You can't have less than 1 attacks. Weapon skill and ballistic skill can be modified to a 1, but 1 always fails still. And damage can't go down to below 1, besides for things that explicitly call it out that you change it to 0. Otherwise, objective control and AP can't go worse than 0 in their own ways as you'd expect. And maybe the only one of these that perhaps wasn't as obvious or didn't make intuitive sense are the caps on leadership. Even if you have multiple stacking positive leadership rules, a 4+ is the best leadership that you can muster, so a 3 or less will always fail. And if you have multiple debuff things, then it can't go worse than a 9+. I'm not sure if that's new or if that was in the previous designer's commentary. In any case, it's certainly new to me. I feel like that one certainly feels a lot more arbitrary compared with the rest. I feel like the rest are all limits that just don't break the game, whereas that one could actually come into effect a couple of times if you had multiple stacking debuffs. Sticking with leadership things, there's a few clarifications to battle shock tests. There's a few bits that say that you can't take multiple battleshock tests in the actual battleshock step of the command phase, even if you had to do it by, say, a unit that was trying to make you test for being below starting strength. But you could still be taking multiple tests in the command phase overall. The command phase has the command step and then the battleshock step, and some things might make you test battleshock in the command step, say the Tyrannid Shadow in the warp. Again, not really a big change there, but it's certainly good for anything that can trigger battleshock tests in the command step. A depleted unit might be testing both in that and then also the battleshock section if they haven't already failed. Finally, there's a bunch of things I consider maybe a bit more minor that I'll try and go through kind of rapid fire. For transports, they underline that you can't make use of datasheet abilities when you're within a transport. That's always been the case really, but just being extra clear that you can't do that when you're using firing deck and things. You can't arrive from reserves and immediately embark in a transport, but additional moves elsewhere in the turn can be used to embark in a transport unless the rule in question absolutely forbids it. We already saw that one being mentioned with the Eliminator's move shoot moving, allowing them to jump back in transports. It's also clarified that if you don't have enough space for disembarking models after a transport gets destroyed, you can put down all the ones that can fit, and then any of the rest of them count as being destroyed by the opponent, though most of the time that doesn't tend to come into too massive effect due to the big 6-inch emergency disembarkation rules. For reserves, after things are set up on the board, you can't use any more movement rules in the movement phase, but you can later in the turn. Things like Tyrannid Gargoyles and Seraphim do that quite regularly. And they also underline that you can deep strike if you're using strategic reserves rules. I think that one's fairly commonly understood, though I guess it was a restriction in previous editions. If you've got units in strategic reserve, they can't deep strike unless you've got all models that have that rule in the same unit. So an attached character with deep strike doesn't necessarily confer it. Again, that seems kind of obvious. If you arrive from strategic reserve, then you have to come in from just one battlefield edge. You couldn't use multiple different battlefield edges, and it extends the unit in a really long way around a corner, I guess. You basically have to pick one battlefield edge and then just ignore the rest for the purposes of that rule. So it still means that you could set them up within a corner, but you couldn't snake them a really long way around the corner in such a way that they're more than 6 inches from that same edge. Otherwise, there's one to say that you can use stratagems on reserve units, which I think is maybe a less obvious one to a lot of players. Lots of stratagems might have certain restrictions like positioning, or you must target a model that's on the battlefield, but if you don't have that, then you can use those on things in reserves in some form. And there's one that clarifies that you can use rapid ingress occasionally to arrive turn 1 if you've got some sort of rule that allows you to arrive from reserves in that turn. However, for specifics on that, the vast majority of those rules will generally say that you can arrive specifically in the reinforcement step of your first turn movement phase, and specific rulings override general there. So the upshot still is that most things that can arrive turn 1 can't rapid ingress. If there's nowhere that satisfies the deep strike conditions, then the models can't be set up. Again, makes sense on that one. If you don't have an eligible target in range, then you can't select a unit to shoot. I guess that shows that you can't just try and select a unit to shoot, even if you've got no targets to trigger something like the Gargoyles move shoot move. And I've added in a core FAQ for extra attacks. There was a rule that basically said that you can't modify them under any circumstances. They basically have changed that a little bit to say that if you've got a rule that specifically calls out that it changes the extra attacks profile, then it can. I think that one's due to the Hunter Rig Butcher Boys in the Orcs Codex. If you have models inside it, you get extra Butcher Boys attacks. And I can see why they've changed that core rule, but it did feel like a case of specific rule overriding general. Death Company and World Eater's Dreadnoughts are confirmed just to be massively dangerous in the fight phase, saying that you can basically activate them as many times as the condition is met. They have those kind of spectacularly dangerous rules which, whenever they're attacked, they can then immediately attack themselves. So say if you charged into a unit and then fought them and killed a bunch of them, when the enemy activates and attacks you back, you then get to make your attacks all over again, and potentially you could be fighting a whole load of times in the fight phase if you're in a big multi-combat somehow. For a few datasheets that have characters in them but aren't actually attached units, if you want to, you can tank some damage on the character if you like, rather than their minions. That could be relevant for St. Celestine or Manius Calgar and the Victrix Honor Guards, though I think most of the time you'd probably rather take the damage on the guards rather than the character. I guess Celestine might be tempting seeing as she can resurrect. Or I guess perhaps it could be worth it if you absolutely need every model to survive for things like objectives or dealing their damage. If a unit's battle shocked, then you still get to use the effects of any stratagems that were used on the unit. It doesn't immediately cancel all stratagem effects, it's only stopping you using any new ones there. So you could potentially use a stratagem or a unit in the command phase and then have the unit be battle shocked in the battle shock step of that same command phase, but that stratagem could still apply for the rest of the turn. You can't slow things like flyers down to anything below their minimum movement, so no using any sort of unusual rules to stop them from being able to fly around the battlefield at their minimum distance there. For models that get to redeploy, if they've already fallen back, then the whole unit still counts as having fallen back, which seems fairly obvious. If you say I had some orcs fall back and then they used their jump to redeploy, they still count as falling back, so can't shoot their guns or anything. And the same applies to any models healed to a unit, the unit's still fallen back, so they count as having fallen back as well. To confirm that consolidating always happens if there's any rules that trigger when a unit consolidates, but no individual model has to choose to move, and often they can't even opt to. Not 100% sure what that's referencing. Probably some sort of specific rule that triggers when you consolidate. And finally, there's a few things to actions, mustering armies, and psychic abilities. The actions one is hard to read any other way, I think. If it says one unit in your army can do this action, it does mean just one in your army. Looks like they needed to tighten the language on that somehow. If characters die and get returned to the battlefield, they can potentially score the enemy more points for assassinate. You can get 2 enhancements within the same squad, despite it saying that normally any one unit can't have multiple enhancements. That's for the mustering armies step and not later in the game, so you could have 2 characters attached to the same squad that allows it, like Orc Boys or something, and have a multi-enhancement squad. And then there's a few clarifications to psychic attacks and abilities. A few of these I think are kind of interesting. The hazardous mortal wounds that you get from, say, a smite attack counts as a smite attack against the own character that used it, so I guess that means that things like librarians will get their own feel no pain against their smite. I guess that feels like it's got a bit of in-universe sense. Psychic datasheet abilities like, say, Typhus's mortal wound attack, that does count as a psychic attack, so you can use saves like feel no pains against his mortal wounds there. And the Thousand Suns Doombolt is also ruled to be a psychic attack here. I feel like that wasn't really what they'd written, even if it was entirely keying off psychic units using it, it does make sense in the lore. Can't really argue that given the whole fluff and feel of it, though, it does feel like it should be counted as a psychic attack, so things that ward psychic should be good against it. Overall, it seems like a fair few good questions answered there. I feel like some of them are maybe a bit more major or minor than others. Obviously, the absolute major things are the ones that really change the game in some sort of big way. But it's nice that Games Workshop have gone through a whole load of the less obvious things in 40k, collated some FAQs, and made a few erratas where they felt it was necessary. I feel like reorganising that document is a good thing for getting people playing on the same page. For these ones, I quite like the change to the fast dice and single rerolls. I think it's quite good to have that first turn and return to reserve things clarified in a more central way. I think it was pretty sensible for the big guns never tire firing deck and Overwatch thing to be written out in a fairly simple FAQ. I've certainly seen that one cause some debate. Let me know your thoughts on the FAQs down in the comments below, or any other interesting things that you've noticed. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find them linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep them coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.